Hello, friends, and welcome back. Today we've got a shift lead who thought yelling at a teenager was a power move, a military superior who built his whole identity around discipline and got crushed by it, and a group of lawyers who missed one tiny detail that cost them everything. Let's get into it. She called me stupid, then gave me permission to walk out. The shift lead who said it, Adriana, 20-something, tried to get me fired after dismissing me from my shift. I got the job at 16 because I was dating one of the other shift leads, already off to a terrible start, I know. My boyfriend was one of those characters that people either loved or hated, mostly hated if you come from a loving home because he was admittedly a terrible person, and Adriana especially hated him. I'm sure she had her reasons. One Saturday morning, I showed up to work to find Adriana yammering about my boyfriend calling out that day. He didn't tell me he was calling out, and since Adriana was visibly upset already about his absence, I texted him to ask, "What's up? Why'd you call out?" Adriana's really mad about being short-staffed on a Saturday, and now she's going to be yelling at me about it all shift. My boyfriend was a real crap stirrer, and I was somehow incredibly effing oblivious to this at the time. I texted him mostly to vent, but of course he used this as an excuse to start an argument with Adriana. He texts her something accusing her of talking crap, which for the record I did not say she was doing, and I can hear from the kitchen she immediately started yelling into oblivion about how if I have something to say, I should say it to her face, and how I'm a stupid effing dumb bee, literally so effing stupid. This bee is the dumbest girl I've ever met. Why are you even with him? So valid, Queen. I was a little dense back then, I guess. Amidst her tirade about how stupid she thinks I am, she comes into the office where I'm eating my pre-shift breakfast of Boston Market macaroni in total silence. This whole time I was just dissociating into my Mac because what the ever-loving F else would I do? Not only did I come from a home where yelling often led to me dodging flying lamps and drawers, but I was genuinely scared she'd have her cousin jump me if I pissed her off. Well, before this even happened. So she's standing there, I'm eating, kinda smiling out of discomfort, just watching her tear into me even more about my intelligence. Why? Because my boyfriend called out of work. It was honestly so bizarre, had escalated so quickly, and I was so dissociated, life kind of felt like it was moving in slow motion in that moment. She eventually says the magic line that snapped me out of my dissociation and freed me from my wage slave chains that lovely Saturday morning. "If you don't want to be here, then leave, because I don't need you." Now again, this is Saturday morning at a Pizza Hut that's already short-staffed. I knew for a fact that she was bullcrapping not needing me, but I also knew that she said it right in front of the office cameras. So I'm thinking that sounded like approval to leave early, didn't it? Especially after being effing berated for 15 minutes straight, as soon as I walked in the door for something I didn't even do. She later tried to get me fired for walking out on my shift, and the first thing I did was tell the general manager to check the cameras. I should have just let them fire me, honestly. The general manager saw exactly who created the problem. Adriana's plan backfired because she forgot that video evidence doesn't have a memory problem. Adriana, if you're out there, I live every day thanking God that I didn't have to experience a phase of life that included screaming at 16-year-old girls first thing in the morning at my big fancy Pizza Hut shift lead job. I heard you also got fired for assaulting a customer. It's okay. I understand that being a shift lead at Pizza Hut's a very high-stakes environment to be working in. No, really, you don't look insane at all, screaming your head off inside a fast food joint on a near-daily basis. Completely sane and very intelligent behavior right there. And our second story. He ruined a soldier's month. The soldier ended his career. This goes back a number of years, back when I was still in the Army and learning very quickly that discipline wasn't always about fairness. It was about timing, visibility, and whether someone higher up decided they needed to make a point that day. Most of what I knew at the time was surface level, just what we saw during formations and heard through the usual barracks gossip. The rest of the story, the part that turns it from frustrating to almost poetic, I only found out recently when I ran into an old buddy and we started swapping stories. We had a sergeant major at the time, the kind who lived and breathed regulations and loved reminding everyone else that they didn't measure up. He wasn't incompetent and he wasn't lazy, but he had a very specific philosophy about discipline that he repeated like it was carved into stone tablets. Regardless of the circumstances, he'd say during formation, pacing back and forth in front of us. If you did it, you should be punished. It didn't matter if 10 other people had done the same thing and gotten away with it. If you were the one standing there when he decided to enforce the rule, you were the example. Most of us learned to keep our heads down and avoid being that example. Joe, unfortunately, had a streak of bad luck that month. A few soldiers had already been late to formation, and command was clearly getting irritated about it. They let a couple of incidents slide with warnings, but you could feel the shift in tone. Everyone knew it was only a matter of time before someone got hammered to make the message stick. That someone ended up being Joe. The day it happened, Joe showed up late to morning formation by a few minutes. Nothing dramatic, no wild excuse, just one of those everyday screw-ups that usually earned you a chewing out and maybe some extra duty. This time, though, the atmosphere changed the moment he stepped into line. The sergeant major locked onto him immediately like he'd been waiting for exactly this moment. "Late again?" he snapped, loud enough for everyone to hear. Joe tried to explain, but it didn't matter. The decision had already been made. Within a day, Joe was hit with extra duty and a financial penalty that came out to around $2,000. For a junior enlisted soldier, that wasn't pocket change. It hurt, plain and simple. What made it worse was the inconsistency. We all knew people who'd been late that same month and walked away with nothing more than a warning. Joe just happened to be the one who got caught at the wrong time under the wrong spotlight with a sergeant major who was in the mood to prove a point. I remember Joe taking it better than most of us expected. He didn't argue publicly, didn't make a scene, just nodded, took the punishment, and went about his business. If anything, he looked almost too calm, like he'd already decided something and wasn't interested in sharing it. At the time, we chalked it up to him being smart enough not to make things worse. In hindsight, that calm wasn't acceptance, it was patience. What none of us knew then was that the sergeant major had his own situation brewing off base. Turns out he'd been involved in an ongoing affair with a woman in town. That alone was risky enough, given how the military handles certain conduct, but it gets better. That woman just happened to be related to Joe. Not distant, not vague, his cousin. The kind of connection that makes a small world story turn into a problem real fast. From what I was told later, Joe didn't even know about the connection at first. It came to him after the punishment when his cousin reached out and started putting pieces together. Once she realized who Joe was talking about, things escalated quickly. She had messages, photos, and enough evidence to make it very clear that this wasn't a misunderstanding or a one-time mistake. It was a full-blown violation of the standards the sergeant major loved to lecture us about. That's when the situation shifted from bad luck to deliberate action. Joe didn't go yelling about it in the barracks or try to turn it into some kind of public spectacle. He did something much more effective. He gathered the evidence, organized it, and sent it up the chain of command where it couldn't be ignored. At the same time, copies of that same evidence made their way to the sergeant major's wife. No drama, no warning, just a clean, direct delivery to the people who could actually do something about it. The same system the sergeant major used to punish Joe was now being used against him. And because the evidence was undeniable, there was no way to sweep it under the rug. Joe didn't break any rules, he just made sure the rules were applied evenly. The fallout didn't happen overnight, but it didn't take long either. Once the investigation started, there was no walking it back. Adultery, especially at that level, isn't just a personal issue in the military, it's a violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The same system the sergeant major had leaned on to justify punishing Joe was now being applied to him. And this time, there was no room for interpretation. Word started spreading quietly at first, meetings behind closed doors, sudden changes in schedule, that kind of thing. Then came the official notice that the sergeant major would be retiring earlier than planned. It was framed in the usual careful language, but no one was confused about what it meant. His career was effectively over. Not with a bang, but with a forced exit that stripped away everything he'd built up over the years. The personal consequences were just as severe, if not worse. From what we heard later, the situation at home collapsed completely once the evidence came out. Divorce followed, and with it a significant financial hit that wiped out $500K. The same man who'd stood in front of us talking about accountability was now facing it in a way he probably never imagined. When I caught up with Joe years later and heard the full story, it all clicked into place. That calm he'd shown after getting punished wasn't resignation. It was someone deciding to play the long game. I asked him straight up if it had been intentional, if he'd really gone through all that trouble just to make a point. He shrugged and said, "I just followed what he told us. If you do it, you should get punished." There wasn't any gloating in his voice, no sense of triumph, just a simple statement delivered the same way the sergeant major used to deliver his speeches. The difference was that Joe had applied that philosophy evenly, without exceptions or selective enforcement. He didn't break any rules to make it happen. He just made sure the existing ones were applied where they were supposed to be. Looking back on it now, it's hard not to see the irony. The sergeant major spent months telling us that discipline wasn't about fairness, that it was about being accountable when you got caught. In the end, that exact mindset came back around and landed on him. The only difference was that when it was his turn, there was no one above him willing to look the other way. And our last story. Opposing lawyers missed one detail. It lost them the case. My dad's worked as a civil engineer for as long as I can remember. The kind of guy who can look at a map of pipes and instantly tell you where something's going to fail before it actually does. 4 years, he held a senior position with a mid-sized city overseeing water systems, waste management, and pretty much anything underground that nobody thinks about until it breaks. He wasn't flashy about it, but he took pride in keeping things running smoothly. That's why it was so jarring to see him come home one week looking like someone had drained all the energy out of him. It started on a Tuesday. He walked in, dropped his bag a little harder than usual, and went straight to the kitchen without saying much. Normally, he'd give a rundown of his day or complain about a contractor cutting corners, but that night, he barely said a word. The next day was the same, and by the third day, it was impossible to ignore. I finally asked what was going on, and he just sat there for a second before saying, "We've got a lawsuit breathing down our necks, and it's bad." Once he started explaining, it made more sense why he looked like he hadn't slept. Apparently, a group had filed a case against the city claiming the existing sewage infrastructure was outdated and insufficient. From what I understood, the argument was that the system couldn't handle projected demand and that failure to upgrade it posed a risk. The city had inherited most of that infrastructure from decades ago, long before my dad ever worked there, but none of that mattered now. The demand in the lawsuit was simple and brutal. Build a new, expanded piping system or face serious legal consequences. He told me the projected cost, and even without knowing all the details, I could see why he was stressed. We're talking millions of dollars, months of planning, rerouting, approvals, construction delays, and the kind of disruption that makes every resident in a city angry at once. On top of that, the timeline they were pushing for was aggressive, bordering on unrealistic. "They're acting like we can just snap our fingers and rebuild half the system," he said, rubbing his forehead. "If we mess this up, it's my head on the line." Over the next couple of days, the situation didn't improve. He kept bringing home documents, maps, legal notices, and stacks of paperwork that looked like they'd multiply overnight. You could tell he was trying to find a solution that didn't involve tearing the entire city apart just to satisfy the lawsuit. At one point, he even muttered, "It doesn't make sense. There's something off about how they worded this." That stuck with me, because if there was one thing my dad was good at, it was spotting when something didn't add up. At the time, I was studying law, or at least trying to, so I asked if I could take a look at the documents. He shrugged and said, "Knock yourself out. If you find something I missed, I'll buy you dinner for a month." I figured it couldn't hurt to read through them, even if it was just to understand what he was dealing with. So I sat down that night and started going through everything, line by line. The more I read, the more I realized the case wasn't as airtight as it looked at first glance. The language was strong, but it was also very specific. The demand stated that the city needed to install a new piping system that met certain capacity requirements. It talked about expansion, about compliance, about physical installation. What it didn't explicitly say was that the new system had to be operational, connected, or actively used. That absence kept nagging at me. I went back through the documents again, slower this time, looking for anything that contradicted that interpretation. There wasn't anything. No clause about integration with the existing system, no requirement that the pipes be live, just that they be installed. I read it a third time to make sure I wasn't missing something obvious. Then I went upstairs and told my dad, I think they left themselves a loophole. He didn't react right away, which is how I knew he was taking it seriously. I walked him through what I'd found, pointing out the exact wording and what it did and didn't require. He pulled out his own copy and followed along, reading it again with that same intense focus he used when reviewing engineering plans. After a few minutes, he leaned back and said, "If you're right, this changes everything." We didn't jump on it immediately. He double-checked with the city's legal team, and they went through the same process, verifying that the interpretation would hold up if challenged. Once they were confident, the plan shifted completely. Instead of designing a fully integrated system that would require massive disruption, they designed a compliance system that met every technical requirement outlined in the lawsuit, on paper and in physical form. Construction still took time, but it was far more controlled than the original nightmare scenario. New pipes were laid, inspected, and documented exactly as required. They met the specifications, the capacity guidelines, and every measurable standard listed in the case. What they didn't do was connect those pipes into the main system. They existed, they were installed, and they satisfied the letter of the demand, but they weren't carrying anything. The lawyers wrote the demand, and the engineers built exactly what was written. Not what was intended. That's not cheating, that's reading comprehension. And it turns out the other side's lawyers weren't as thorough as a law student with time on her hands. When the opposing side realized what had happened, they weren't exactly calm about it. The hearing that followed was something I made sure to attend, partly out of curiosity and partly because I wanted to see if this would actually hold up. The other lawyers came in swinging, arguing that the spirit of the agreement had been violated. One of them actually slammed his hand on the table and said, "This is not what was intended." My dad's side didn't even raise their voices. They just pointed back to the wording line by line and demonstrated that every requirement had been fulfilled. The judge asked a few pointed questions, flipping through the documents, and you could see where it was going. Intent didn't matter as much as the actual language, and the language was on our side. After a short recess, the ruling came down, and the case was dismissed. The reaction from the other side was about as subtle as you'd expect. Faces turned red, voices got louder, and there was a lot of frustration that didn't have anywhere useful to go. Meanwhile, my dad just sat there looking more relieved than I'd seen him in weeks. On the way out, he leaned over and said quietly, "Dinner's on me for a while." Back at work, things settled down quickly. The city avoided a massive financial hit, and my dad's job was no longer hanging by a thread. He even got a small bonus, which he tried to downplay, but I could tell it meant something to him. Every now and then, he'll still mention that case, usually when talking about how important it is to read every word of a document. He doesn't call it clever or strategic, just necessary. The pipes are still there, by the way, perfectly installed, completely compliant, and doing absolutely nothing. Out of the three, the second story easily takes it. That sergeant major built his entire authority on one idea. If you mess up, you get punished. No exceptions, no context, no flexibility. And it worked, right up until it didn't. And in the end, the guy who enforced discipline the hardest was the one who couldn't survive it. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.